When he secretly visited one of his own restaurants, CEO Richard discovered a toxic work environment marked by employee mistreatment and low morale. Determined to bring about change, he confronted and disciplined the manager and head chef, implemented promotion and improvement programs for the staff, and revitalized the restaurant, reaffirming the importance of valuing both employees and customers. Richard Grayson, the CEO of a renowned fine dining restaurant chain spanning across the U.S., had spent 20 years pursuing perfection. With tailored suits and razor-sharp instincts, he had transformed a small eatery in Chicago into a culinary empire over 2 decades. But tonight, Richard wasn't in his luxurious downtown office. Disguised in a worn baseball cap and faded jacket, he quietly stepped into one of his own establishments, an intimate Italian bistro named Trattoria Bella in suburban Seattle. He wanted to see the truth behind the glowing reviews, unclouded by his own reputation. Seated at a small table near the kitchen entrance, Richard ordered the restaurant's specialty, spaghetti carbonara, a dish he himself had perfected years ago. The plate arrived, steaming and promising, pecorino cheese sauce, crispy pancetta, and pasta cooked to perfection. He twirled his fork and took the first bite. Delicious. Perhaps too delicious. But then, through the narrow window into the kitchen, something caught his eye. Head chef Marco Ricci, a lean Italian known for his finesse, was hunched over a simmering pot. Richard saw Marco retrieve a small, unlabeled bottle from his apron pocket, adding a few drops of a clear liquid into the sauce. Marco glanced around nervously before quickly tucking the bottle away. Richard's fork halted mid-air. He knew the carbonara recipe like the back of his hand. Eggs, cheese, pork fat, black pepper, nothing else. What the hell was that? Richard set his plate down, his appetite replaced by suspicion. He stood, pretending to head to the restroom, but instead lingered near the kitchen door. Through the gap, he overheard Marco whispering to a young sous chef named Tyler. "Just a little enhancer," Marco said, smirking. "Keeps the customers coming back. The boss will never know." Tyler shrugged. "As long as my paycheck arrives, I don't care what's in it." That was enough. Richard pushed the door open, stepping into the bright, chaotic kitchen. "What's in it, Marco?" His voice was low but cut through the clatter of pans. Marco spun around, eyes wide. "Who are you? Customers aren't allowed back here." Richard removed his cap, revealing the steel gaze that had silenced many boardrooms. "I'm Richard Grayson, and I want to know what you just put in my carbonara." Marco's face went pale. The small bottle tumbled from his apron, rolling across the tiled floor. Richard picked it up, a cheap plastic container, unlabeled, carrying a faint chemical scent. "Explain," he ordered. Marco stammered. It's just a flavor enhancer. MSG, you know? Harmless." Richard's jaw tightened. "MSG isn't kept in unlabeled bottles in your pocket." "Try again." Cornered, Marco caved. All right. It's a synthetic compound, a lab-made additive. Some guy gave it to me, said it would make the food addictive. Paid me $5,000 to test it here." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Marco hesitated, then uttered a name. "Paul Decker. Runs Decker Dining Group. Said he'd take down Grayson's if I helped." Paul Decker, Richard's longtime rival, a ruthless restaurateur who had been trailing him for years. The confession hit like a punch. Richard pulled out his phone and called operations management. "Shut this place down immediately. I want every ingredient, every supplier checked." He turned to Marco. "You're finished. And you're lucky I'm not pressing charges." "Not yet." The next hour was a whirlwind. Health inspectors swarmed Trattoria Bella, finding traces of the synthetic enhancer in multiple dishes. Marco wasn't alone. 2 other employees admitted to secretly adding it to soups and sauces under Decker's bribery. The compound wasn't toxic, but it was unapproved, unethical, and a betrayal of everything Richard stood for. By midnight, Richard stood alone in the empty kitchen, staring at the tainted carbonara. He dumped the entire pot down the drain, watching the creamy swirls disappear. The next morning, he confronted Decker at a downtown cafe. "You really thought you could take me down with cheap tricks?" Richard said, sliding over a recording of Marco's confession. Decker smirked, unfazed. "Prove it in court, Richie. I've got a whole team of lawyers." Returning from his meeting with Decker, an unsettling feeling still clung to Richard. Something was off. The silence from his staff was too suspicious. The next morning, Richard summoned the entire staff of Trattoria Bella, chefs, kitchen assistants, servers, and even janitors, into the main dining hall. 20 people stood in a line, eyes downcast, not daring to meet his gaze. "I want the truth," Richard said, his voice low but razor-sharp. "Who knew about what Marco was doing? Who was involved?" Silence. Only the sound of nervous breathing and shoes shifting against the wooden floor. He tapped his fingers on the table, scanning each face. No one saw Marco pouring that into the pot. Finally, Sarah, a young server with her hair tied up high, spoke up, her voice trembling. "Mr. Grayson, we weren't sure if you really wanted to know." Richard narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Sarah glanced around as if searching for help, but no one spoke. She took a deep breath. "We all knew. And it wasn't just Marco." Her confession was like a stone shattering the surface of a still lake. Richard felt the heat rising in his face. "Go on." Sarah swallowed hard, then said, "Marco wasn't acting alone. He was just the executioner. Everyone here had a part in it." She pointed through the crowd. "Tyler put it in the soup. Lisa mixed it into the marinara sauce. I sprinkled it on the salads when Marco told me to." Decker didn't just bribe Marco, he bribed the whole restaurant. Richard could hardly believe it. He turned to Tyler, the young kitchen assistant who had stood next to Marco the previous night. "Is that true?" Tyler bit his lip, then nodded. "Decker came here 3 months ago. He said that if the whole team cooperated, everyone would get $2,000 a month, as long as they kept quiet. Marco got more because he was in charge." Lisa, another kitchen assistant, added, "We didn't want to, Mr. Grayson. But that money, it was a lot for us. And Decker said that if anyone talked, he'd make sure we never found work again." The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. Richard realized he wasn't just facing a single traitor. This was a systematic infiltration, deeply rooted within the very team he had trusted. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" he growled. An older janitor, Joe, finally spoke. "We were scared, sir. Decker has people everywhere. He knows where we live, where our kids go to school. He wasn't just threatening our jobs, he was threatening our lives." The picture became clear. Paul Decker hadn't just wanted to tarnish the reputation of Grayson's Gourmet, he wanted to control it from the inside out. The synthetic compound wasn't just at Trattoria Bella. Tyler admitted that Decker had sent supplies to at least 3 other locations within the chain, using fake vendors. Marco had been just a pawn, but the entire staff had been ensnared in a web of fear and greed. Richard felt as if the ground beneath him had crumbled. He had built Trattoria Bella from a simple idea, personally selecting each member of this team. Now, they looked at him with guilt and desperation. He turned away, stepping out into the rain-soaked streets of Seattle, struggling to piece his thoughts together. Facing Decker was no longer a personal matter, it was a battle to save his entire empire. The next day, Richard didn't just shut down Trattoria Bella. He ordered a full-scale audit of Grayson's Gourmet, all 47 restaurants across the country. He hired a private investigation team to trace Decker's supply chain. The results were worse than he had imagined. Traces of the synthetic compound had been found in at least 5 locations, though at lower levels. Decker hadn't just bribed employees, he had planted his own people in lower management positions, ensuring silence. The confrontation reached its peak when Richard faced Decker at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, where investigators had uncovered Decker's stash of the compound. Decker stood there, a cigar in hand, smirking. "You think you've won, Richie?" he sneered. "You can't fire the whole world. I've got money, I've got people, I've got everything." Richard stepped forward, jabbing a finger at him. "You can buy them, but you can't buy me. And I'm going to make sure you pay." Richard didn't wait for the police. He handed over all the evidence, recordings, documents, chemical samples, to the FBI, who had already been tracking Decker for other shady dealings. Within a month, Decker was arrested for food fraud and witness intimidation. Richard Grayson and Paul Decker were not always enemies. In fact, they were once colleagues, perhaps even friends, working under the legendary chef Giovanni Bellucci at Bellucci's, a prestigious restaurant in New York. Back then, Richard was a young, talented chef with ambitions of building his own culinary empire, while Decker was a shrewd, calculating man who knew how to maneuver his way to the top. The two started their careers around the same time, but while Richard focused on the quality of his dishes and his reputation, Decker was more interested in profits and power. When Bellucci decided to choose a successor to run his restaurant, Decker was certain it would be him. But to his shock, Bellucci chose Richard instead. "You have heart," Bellucci told Decker one fateful evening. "You're talented, Paul, but to you, food is just a means to an end. To Richard, it's an art. And I need someone who loves food, not someone who wants to control it." Those words cut straight into Decker's pride like a knife. He had spent 5 years cultivating relationships, charming investors, ensuring his path to the top, only for it all to come crashing down because of some naive chef who still believed in the love of cooking. Decker refused to accept defeat. He left Bellucci's and opened his own restaurant, but he could never achieve the level of acclaim that Richard did. His first venture, the Chill Fork, gained quick fame for its lavish dishes, but whispers of subpar ingredients and price manipulation soon drove customers away. Meanwhile, Richard founded Grayson's Gourmet, building his empire on quality and trust. That only fueled Decker's resentment. More than 20 years later, Paul Decker had become a powerful businessman, but he never forgot the humiliation of that night. He had waited, chipping away at Richard's success, bribing those around him, orchestrating the downfall of Grayson's Gourmet piece by piece. But he had underestimated Richard Grayson. After uncovering the orchestrated sabotage, Richard rebuilt Trattoria Bella from the ground up. The restaurant, and every other establishment in his chain, was cleansed from the inside out. The old staff was replaced entirely. Richard personally oversaw the new hiring process, ensuring that not a single trace of Decker remained in his empire. Trattoria Bella reopened on a cold morning. Gone was the musty scent, the oppressive heaviness of those dark days before. In its place, the air was filled with the warm aroma of freshly baked bread and rich tomato sauce. Richard Grayson stood behind the counter, ladle in hand, stirring a pan of carbonara, listening to the satisfying sizzle of bacon hitting the heat. He was no longer just a man in a suit managing from a distance. He was the first to step into the kitchen in the morning and the last to leave at night. Customers slowly returned, most unaware of what had transpired. All they knew was that the food was as good as ever, perhaps even better. But for those inside the restaurant, the change was more than just about flavor. Richard hadn't just changed the menu. He had changed the people. Firing the old staff didn't mean everything would instantly fall into place. Even among the new hires, there were those who resisted his way of running things. Jonathan Marks, the former supply chain manager, was one of them. "Everything you're doing is too extreme," Jonathan complained in their first meeting after the reopening. "You micromanage every ingredient, refuse flexibility with suppliers, and now you want to oversee every single plate that goes out? If you keep this up, we won't last long." Richard didn't frown. He didn't get angry. Instead, he placed a sheet of paper on the table, an analysis of all the vulnerabilities in the previous system, the very gaps that allowed people like Marco and Decker to slip through. "If I don't do this, history will repeat itself," Richard said, his voice calm but firm. "If you don't believe in what I'm building, you should leave." A week later, Jonathan handed in his resignation. Richard didn't bother convincing him to stay. Instead, he hired Emily Carter, a woman with sharp eyes and over a decade of experience managing restaurants. On her first day, Emily walked through the kitchen, inspecting every tray of ingredients, every service process. When she returned to the office, she simply said, "You want to do this right, then I'll make sure you do it all the way." Changes began happening faster. Employees no longer worked just for a paycheck, they worked for an opportunity. Sarah, the young waitress who had once been terrified of being caught up in Decker's scheme, was now promoted to lead server. Tyler, who had once assisted Marco, was allowed to stay, but only if he proved himself through every dish he prepared. Richard didn't just impose rules. He created a training program where kitchen staff experimented with new recipes, servers learned about wine pairings and customer service skills. They weren't just working. They were learning to be the best. But the biggest challenge remained: earning back customer trust. While the public never fully knew about the scandal, Richard understood that if Trattoria Bella was to become truly unshakable, he needed to do more than just improve the restaurant from within. Instead of launching flashy promotions, he introduced Open Kitchen Week, allowing diners to tour the kitchen and see firsthand how their meals were prepared. Nothing was hidden. They could witness the fresh ingredients, hear the chefs explain their craft. On every table, Richard placed a small card. "We are committed to serving you the most honest meal. If anything does not meet your expectations, tell us at your table, we will make it right." The first reviews began appearing online. "I've never seen a restaurant let customers into the kitchen to watch them cook. That kind of transparency says everything. The carbonara is amazing. But the best part, the staff actually understands the food they serve. Trattoria Bella is back, and I trust it more than ever." Every compliment was another step forward. Richard didn't talk much about what he had done to change the restaurant. He let the quality speak for itself. Late one night, after the restaurant had closed, Emily leaned against the counter, watching Richard wipe down each plate meticulously. "Do you think things have truly settled?" she asked. Richard paused, glancing around the space. The polished wooden tables, the neatly arranged chairs, the lingering scent of wine in the air. "One day at a time," he said, setting down the last plate. "One meal at a time." Trattoria Bella was back. But this time, nothing could shake it.